Good evening, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at a real, documented turning point from the opening weeks of the Korean War. An early decision made under pressure that quietly reshaped how American units fought for survival. This is not a legend and not a movie scene. It's the kind of small, practical choice that can decide whether hundreds of men escape or get cut off. And it begins in July 1950, when the war moved faster than the U.S. Army could adapt. By July 1950, the American Army on the Korean Peninsula was not failing because it lacked discipline or nerve. It was failing because it entered the fight late, with light forces, thin logistics, and assumptions inherited from occupation duty rather than high-tempo war. In the first month, time itself became the enemy. Each day the front moved south, and each day the margin for orderly withdrawal narrowed. The North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, and the pace of the collapse was immediate. South Korean units were pushed back on multiple roads at once, their lines splitting and recombining in confusion. Seoul fell on June 28, a decisive psychological and logistical blow, because the capital was not only a symbol, it was a node. When it fell, command links fractured, supply routes became contested, and civilian evacuation turned highways into choke points that armies could not simply drive through. In those same days, the peninsula became crowded in a way maps do not show. Refugees moved south with whatever they could carry, often under the noise of artillery in the distance. Bridges became bottlenecks. Villages emptied and then filled again with retreating soldiers. Radios struggled in mountainous terrain. Signal plans designed for peacetime often failed when units moved rapidly and unpredictably. In that environment, the difference between an organized withdrawal and a routed flight could be measured in minutes. American forces were rushed from Japan in the first emergency deployments, beginning with Task Force Smith and followed by more substantial formations as the crisis deepened. Many soldiers believed they were entering a limited, temporary mission, something closer to policing than campaigning. Some officers expected the enemy to break when confronted by U.S. uniforms and U.S. firepower. Those expectations did not survive first contact. The battlefield did not pause to let units acclimate. North Korean formations were structured for speed and penetration. Their early success was not accidental. It reflected planning, discipline, and a coherent operational style. Many of their officers had combat experience from the Chinese Civil War, and their units moved with a clarity that surprised American observers. They advanced along key roads, exploited confusion, and pressured retreating forces before defensive lines could harden. In the lead, on the most important avenues, came armor. The center of that armored threat in the summer of 1950 was the T-34-85. It was a veteran machine, built for the Second World War, proven on the Eastern Front, and by 1950 no longer the newest design. But it remained extremely dangerous in Korea because its strengths matched the battlefield. Its 85mm gun could defeat light armor and threaten medium tanks at typical engagement distances. Its sloped armor increased the chance that incoming rounds would fail to penetrate. Its diesel engine offered steady endurance for long road marches, and its overall profile gave North Korean crews confidence that few opponents could stop them. South Korean forces had almost no effective way to deal with that kind of armor. Their anti-tank capability was limited and often scattered. In many sectors, it simply did not exist at the point of impact. When American units arrived, they were not immediately able to solve the problem either. The U.S. Army had demobilized rapidly after 1945, and occupation duty in Japan had not demanded the same readiness as a major ground war. Armor units were under strength. Training priorities emphasized garrison routines, not maneuver warfare under fire. Anti-tank weapons were scarce, and some that were available proved unreliable or inadequate against the T-34 in realistic conditions. As a result, American armor in July 1950 often relied on what was already in theater. the M4A3E8 Sherman. 5 years earlier, Shermans had fought across Europe and helped defeat German forces through coordination, mass, and combined arms. But Korea was not Europe. Numbers were lower, support was uneven, and the fight often happened on narrow roads where a single disabled vehicle could block the entire line of movement. In those conditions, the Sherman's limitations were not theoretical, they were immediate. The key problem was the gun. The Sherman's 76mm weapon could be effective, but it struggled against the T-34's frontal armor, especially when range increased and angles were unfavorable. Crews understood this in practical terms. Head-on fights were the wrong fights. Doctrine warned against trying to win a direct contest of armor and penetration. Yet doctrine can collapse when geography removes options. In Korea's hills and valleys, contact sometimes happened at the worst possible angle on the worst possible road, with retreat routes already congested and the enemy already pressing. Beyond the technical balance, there was the psychological weight of the machine itself. The T-34 did not just destroy vehicles, it shaped decisions before firing a shot. Its silhouette on a road could make infantry feel exposed. Its engine sound could signal inevitability. North Korean crews understood that fear as a weapon. In the early weeks, they advanced boldly, often moving in columns with minimal security, because experience suggested resistance would be thin. Most of the time, that calculation was correct. American units were committed piece by piece to slow the advance, buying time rather than winning ground. Some men brought experience from the Second World War, but many did not. Equipment arrived unevenly. Maps were sometimes outdated or insufficiently detailed for local terrain. Radios failed in mountains and valleys, and coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was often improvised on the move. Under those conditions, even competent units could be pushed into reactive decisions. By late July, the front had contracted towards central Korea, and the city of Daejeon became a critical point on the withdrawal. Roads converged there, and the geography offered fewer safe exits. An armored breakthrough in that area could cut off entire formations and turn withdrawal into encirclement. It was in this setting that one American tank platoon was sent forward on a narrow road outside the city, with a mission that sounded simple but carried severe consequences: delay the enemy long enough for infantry behind them to disengage. There would be no guarantee of reinforcements and no certainty of air support. The outcome would depend on terrain, judgment, and restraint, and on whether men inside older tanks could impose order on a situation that was dissolving by the hour. Write in the comments which city you're from and subscribe to the channel. That's the best support. And we move on. The position south of Daejeon was not chosen for comfort or safety. It was chosen because it was one of the few places where terrain could partially offset weakness. The road bent gently between low hills, forcing vehicles to slow and commit before they could see what lay ahead. Rice paddies pressed close to the asphalt, their waterlogged soil unsuitable for rapid maneuver. In summer, fog drifted in and out without warning, compressing visibility and distorting distance. For defenders willing to wait, it offered one narrow advantage. The platoon from the 70th Tank Battalion arrived there without ceremony. 4 M4A3E8 Shermans, worn by movement and short on fuel, rolled into position before first light. Ammunition loads had already been reduced by previous actions, and resupply was uncertain. The crews had learned not to ask when relief would arrive. In the previous days, orders had changed repeatedly: advance, hold, withdraw, sometimes within the same afternoon. Fatigue was constant, but routine kept the men functional. The platoon sergeant understood exactly what kind of fight this road could impose. His experience in Europe had taught him that terrain mattered more than intention. He also understood what not to do. Only days earlier, he had seen a Sherman destroyed after engaging an enemy tank head-on on a similar stretch of road. The engagement had lasted seconds. The crew had not escaped. That image remained fixed in his mind, not as fear, but as instruction. When reports arrived of a North Korean armored column moving south, there was no illusion of choice. Retreat was no longer an option. Infantry units were withdrawing behind the tanks, counting on them to block the road long enough to disengage. If the armor failed, there would be no orderly movement, only congestion, confusion, and collapse. The sergeant understood that his task was not to win ground, but to buy time at a cost the enemy did not expect. He walked the terrain carefully, measuring angles and distances with his eyes. The embankments beside the road were not high, but they were solid. If the Shermans stayed off the asphalt, their hulls could be masked while their turrets retained a clear arc of fire. Trees and brush could be used to disrupt outlines, especially in fog. It was not concealment in the absolute sense, but it was enough to delay recognition for a few critical seconds. Orders were passed in low voices. The tanks moved into position slowly, tracks biting into soft earth. Branches were tied down. Nets were adjusted by hand to avoid sharp movement. Engines were shut down early, even though restarting them later would carry risk. Inside the tanks, the air quickly grew stale. Sweat gathered under helmets. No one spoke unless necessary. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. The plan was precise because it had to be. No engagement at range, no reaction to infantry, no premature movement. The T-34s had to enter the road bend fully, exposing their sides and committing their momentum. Only then would the Shermans fire. The sergeant emphasized the distance again, less than 300 meters. At that range, the Sherman's gun could do what it could not do farther out. Beyond that, success dropped sharply. Targets were assigned in advance. Each crew knew which tank it would engage and when. There would be no correction phase, no ranging shots. Ammunition could not be wasted, and surprise could not be recovered once lost. If the first volley failed, the platoon would be forced into a fight it could not control. The radios would check one final time. Silence followed. As dawn approached, movement appeared on the road. North Korean infantry came first, walking with a confidence shaped by weeks of unchallenged advance. Rifles were carried casually. There were no flank scouts, no pauses to check the embankments. The road had delivered victory before, and there was no immediate reason to doubt it now. The American crews watched without moving, fingers off triggers, discipline holding. Then the sound reached them, a steady, low engine note, unmistakable. The first T-34 emerged through the fog, turret facing forward, gun fixed on the road ahead. It passed the concealed Shermans without slowing, its mass filling the narrow lane. A second tank followed, then a third, the column stretching just enough as the bend compressed their spacing. Inside his turret, the sergeant counted silently. He watched the distance close, watched the lead tank move beyond the embankment, watched the second expose its side. He waited for commitment, for the moment when reversal would be slow and confusion inevitable. When the geometry aligned, he gave the signal. The firing was sudden and close. Shells struck from the side and rear, not from ahead. Armor failed where it was weakest. One tank slowed immediately, smoke spilling from its engine compartment. Another locked in place under its turret. The effect was immediate and disorienting. For the first time on that road, the advance did not continue forward. It stopped, uncertain, under fire it had not anticipated. The first seconds after the opening shots were marked not by panic, but by hesitation. North Korean tank crews had trained to push through resistance from the front, using armor and momentum to break opposition before it could organize. What they encountered instead was fire from the flanks, at a distance too close to ignore and too sudden to analyze. The narrow road left little room to maneuver, and the orderly column dissolved into uncertainty almost immediately. Attempts to regain control only deepened the problem. One T-34 tried to reverse, but the road behind it was already blocked by following vehicles. A round struck its rear armor, penetrating near the engine compartment and igniting fuel. Another tank veered off the asphalt into the rice fields, where the waterlogged ground offered no support. Its tracks spun briefly before the suspension failed, leaving the vehicle immobilized and exposed. Within moments, movement turned into obstruction. Inside the American Shermans, the response was measured and deliberate. Crews followed the plan without deviation. No one fired twice at the same target unless necessary. Shots were aimed at areas known to fail under pressure: engine decks, turret rings, and tracks. The intention was not spectacle, but certainty. Ammunition was finite, and every round had to produce an effect. Communication between tanks remained brief and functional, limited to confirmations and timing. Return fire followed, but it lacked direction. North Korean gunners struggled to identify firing positions concealed by embankments, foliage, and fog. Shells exploded against trees and stone walls, showering the area with dirt and fragments. The Shermans absorbed superficial damage, scratches, dents, and chipped fittings, but their armor remained intact. By staying partially masked and avoiding unnecessary movement, they denied the enemy clear targets. The engagement concluded quickly by the standards of armored warfare. Within roughly 10 minutes, 4 T-34-85 tanks were disabled or destroyed on the road. Flames rose from ruptured fuel tanks, producing thick black smoke that drifted across the fields. The smell of burning diesel hung in the air. One remaining tank, its crew recognizing the situation as unsalvageable, turned north and withdrew, abandoning the advance entirely. The American platoon did not pursue the retreating vehicle. This restraint was intentional and critical. Advancing would have required leaving prepared positions and exposing the tanks to threats that had not yet revealed themselves. Artillery fire, infantry anti-tank teams, or additional armor could have been positioned beyond the bend. The mission had never been to chase the enemy. It was to delay long enough for others to escape. Behind the ambush site, infantry units took advantage of the pause. Withdrawals that might have turned chaotic remained controlled. Weapons were recovered. Casualties were moved. Units crossed designated points without pressure from advancing armor. No encirclement occurred, and no collapse followed. The road remained blocked long enough to change outcomes beyond the immediate battlefield. When firing ceased, the tank crews remained in place. Experience dictated caution. Silence after a fight could signal regrouping or incoming fire. Only after several minutes passed without movement did the platoon sergeant permit hatches to open. Crews inspected their vehicles methodically. Armor integrity was confirmed. Guns were still aligned. Engines restarted without issue. No injuries were reported. Infantry soldiers approached the scene carefully, stopping at a distance to observe the destroyed tanks. For many, this was the first time they had seen T-34s disabled at close range. The sight challenged assumptions formed in earlier retreats, where armor had seemed unstoppable. The effect was quiet but important. Confidence does not return all at once, but it can begin with evidence. Later that day, the platoon compiled a formal report. It was concise and factual. Distances were measured. Targets were listed. Ammunition expenditure was recorded. There was no attempt to dramatize the event. Such reports were written to be understood, not remembered. This was how individual actions became part of the institutional record. News of the engagement spread gradually through nearby units. It did not halt the overall withdrawal, and Taejon would still be lost in the days that followed. But the effect was tangible. North Korean commanders adjusted their approach. Columns slowed. Infantry screening increased. Roads were no longer assumed safe by default. Each bend required attention. American units absorbed a parallel lesson. The engagement reinforced a growing realization that equipment alone did not determine outcomes. The Sherman remained outmatched in certain respects, but it was not ineffective when employed with discipline and patience. Terrain, timing, and restraint could compensate for technical disadvantage, at least long enough to matter. The road itself remained unmarked after the war. No designation appeared on maps, and no official name was assigned to the fight. Yet its influence extended beyond its physical boundaries. It demonstrated that even during retreat, limited control could be imposed, deliberately, briefly, and at a cost the enemy did not anticipate. The engagement near Taejon did not reverse the direction of the campaign. Through late July and into early August 1950, American and South Korean forces continued to fall back toward the southeast. Towns were evacuated under pressure, sometimes with only hours of warning. Bridges were destroyed behind retreating columns to slow pursuit. Defensive lines were drawn, tested, and abandoned in rapid succession. On maps, the movement looked continuous and controlled. On the ground, it was fragile and often improvised. Yet beneath this visible withdrawal, a quieter process was underway. Units were not only moving south, they were absorbing experience at a pace rarely seen outside the opening phase of a war. The U.S. Army was relearning armored combat, not through doctrine manuals or exercises, but through repeated contact with an enemy that punished mistakes immediately. Each engagement imposed clarity. What worked survived. What failed disappeared along with the men and machines that attempted it. Early in the campaign, many officers had assumed that technological inferiority explained most losses. The solution, in that view, was replacement: heavier tanks, better guns, improved equipment. By late July, that explanation no longer held on its own. New armored units were indeed being prepared, but they were still weeks away. Until they arrived, survival depended on decisions made with what was already in place. The battlefield did not wait for reinforcements. After-action reports from small engagements began circulating through battalion and regimental headquarters. They were not treated as victories and were rarely highlighted. Instead, they were compared. Officers examined terrain sketches, firing distances, and timing. A pattern emerged with uncomfortable consistency. Frontal engagements against T-34 tanks led to rapid losses. Encounters shaped by concealment, terrain masking, and short-range fire were far more likely to end with American vehicles intact. This forced a change in posture. American armored units were instructed, formally and informally, to give up the idea of initiative in open terrain. The goal was no longer to advance against enemy armor, but to delay it. Roads were no longer treated as paths to be cleared quickly. They became potential traps. Curves, villages, culverts, and embankments were reassessed as positions from which time could be bought, not ground gained. Tank crews were encouraged to think defensively even while moving. Positions were chosen with withdrawal in mind. Engagements were planned around escape routes rather than pursuit. Fire was delivered at distances where effect was certain, not hoped for. These were not heroic adjustments, but practical ones, driven by the recognition that survival depended on control rather than aggression. Coordination with infantry improved by necessity. In the opening weeks, armor and infantry often operated with unclear expectations, each assuming the other would neutralize enemy tanks. That assumption failed repeatedly. Gradually, roles became clearer. Infantry screened likely ambush sites, watched high ground, and warned tank crews of movement beyond their limited visibility. Tanks, in turn, provided predictable blocking points around which infantry withdrawals could be organized. Artillery support remained uneven, constrained by mobility and communication problems. But when it was available, its use became more deliberate. Rather than saturating areas indiscriminately, fire was timed to disrupt movement and break momentum. Even short delays forced armored columns to slow, creating windows in which infantry and armor could reposition. Time, not destruction, became the primary objective. Air support, later remembered as decisive in the Korean War, played only a limited role during this phase. Weather frequently grounded aircraft. Communications between ground units and pilots were unreliable. Forward air controllers were scarce. Tank crews learned quickly that airstrikes could not be assumed and should not factor into immediate decisions. What mattered was what could be controlled locally. The psychological shift within American units was as significant as any tactical adjustment. Early encounters had created the impression that the T-34 was immune to anything they could bring against it. That belief eroded discipline and accelerated retreat. Small, contained actions like the one near Taejon challenged that perception. Once soldiers saw that enemy armor could be stopped under the right conditions, behavior changed measurably. Retreats became more orderly. Panic decreased. Units followed withdrawal plans more closely, even under pressure. Confidence did not return in the form of optimism, but in the form of predictability. Soldiers understood what they could and could not do, and they acted within those limits. That alone reduced losses. North Korean forces adjusted as well. Tank commanders no longer treated roads as secure by default. Infantry screens increased. Columns dispersed to reduce vulnerability. Speed gave way to caution. Each bend and village required assessment. This slowing effect was cumulative, and its consequences extended far beyond individual engagements. The time gained mattered. It allowed American commanders to compress their lines and establish a continuous defensive perimeter farther south. Logistics stabilized incrementally. Units that had been moving without rest gained hours to reorganize. None of this appeared dramatic in reports, and no single engagement defined the shift. But together, these adaptations marked the end of collapse and the beginning of resistance. Throughout August 1950, Sherman tanks continued to operate in an environment for which they had never been intended. Korea's terrain imposed constant constraints. Narrow roads clung to hillsides, steep gradients strained engines and transmissions, and visibility was often reduced by fog, rain, or vegetation. Movement was slow and predictable, making concealment difficult. Maintenance crews worked with limited tools, and spare parts were frequently unavailable. Improvisation became routine rather than exceptional. Despite these conditions, the Shermans remained committed to the fight. There was no alternative. Armor units already in theater could not be withdrawn without exposing infantry formations to direct attack. Every operational decision had to assume the continued presence of these tanks, even as their limitations became more apparent. Crews learned to treat mechanical reliability as uncertain and adjusted plans accordingly, factoring breakdowns and delays into every movement. The arrival of heavier American armor began only gradually. The M26 Pershing reached Korea in small numbers, followed later by the improved M46 Patton. These vehicles offered thicker armor and more powerful guns, but their impact was not immediate. Crews required time to train, units needed to integrate new machines, and supply systems struggled to support additional fuel and maintenance demands. For much of August, these tanks existed more as a promise than a solution. Until those new units could operate in meaningful strength, Sherman crews carried the primary burden of armored defense. Their experience during this period shaped how American armor fought for the remainder of the year. Every engagement reinforced lessons learned earlier, often under pressure and without margin for error. There was no opportunity to pause and reset doctrine. Adjustments had to be made while moving and under threat. Combat encounters followed a consistent pattern. In direct frontal engagements, T-34 tanks maintained a clear advantage. When American units were forced into such fights, losses were predictable and often severe. When terrain allowed concealment, and when crews exercised patience, results improved markedly. Ambushes, short-range engagements, and carefully timed withdrawals offered the best chance of survival. This pattern underscored a difficult truth. No single tactic could be applied universally. Conditions varied from road to road and hour to hour. A position that worked one day could become untenable the next due to weather, enemy adjustment, or simple exhaustion. Commanders could not rely on standard solutions. Success depended on reading the immediate environment and responding accordingly. As a result, tank commanders increasingly planned with withdrawal in mind. Positions were chosen not for their ability to support advance, but for their ability to permit disengagement. Routes were reconnoitered before fighting began. Crews rehearsed movement under fire and accepted that remaining too long in one place could be as dangerous as advancing recklessly. Once surprise was lost, disengagement became the priority. The pace of operations imposed constant psychological pressure. Heat inside the tanks was oppressive, especially during long stationary periods. Engines, radios, and guns produced a continuous background noise that made rest difficult. Sleep came in brief intervals, often interrupted by movement orders or alerts. The knowledge that a single mistake, an exposed hull, a delayed withdrawal, could be fatal shaped behavior at every level. Veterans of the Second World War adapted more readily to these conditions. They recognized familiar patterns, the value of patience, the cost of haste, and the importance of terrain. Younger soldiers, many of whom had never experienced combat, were forced to learn quickly. Those who survived did so by absorbing lessons under pressure, often guided by more experienced crew members. By mid-August, the American defensive line contracted into what became known as the Pusan Perimeter. Geography finally favored defense. Shorter lines reduced the strain on manpower. Supply routes became more secure, allowing fuel and ammunition to reach the front more reliably. Artillery and air support could be coordinated more effectively. For the first time since June, defensive positions had depth. Within this framework, the role of the Sherman tanks shifted again. They no longer operated in isolation, delaying enemy advances alone. Instead, they functioned as part of layered defenses that included infantry, artillery, and air power. Their weaknesses were not eliminated, but they were mitigated. The tanks could now contribute predictably rather than react desperately. The early weeks of August remained decisive in shaping armored doctrine. They removed lingering assumptions about how the war would be fought and replaced them with practical understanding. The ambush near Téjon stood as one example among many, not unique but representative. It demonstrated what disciplined restraint could achieve when no better options existed. It was not a victory of machines, it was a victory of restraint. The road near Téjon returned to silence once the fighting moved farther south. Burned-out vehicles were removed in time, either salvaged for parts or pushed aside to clear traffic. The rice fields bordering the road were replanted, their surfaces smoothed by water and labor. Within months, little remained to indicate that armored combat had taken place there. No sign marked the location, and no formal name was attached to the engagement. In official histories of the Korean War, the action appears only briefly, if at all. It is grouped with dozens of other delaying engagements from the summer of 1950, described in functional terms and then passed over. The scale was small, the duration short, and the outcome did not alter the operational map. In a conflict defined by sweeping advances and reversals, such moments rarely attract sustained attention. Yet the significance of the episode lies precisely in its modesty. It illustrates how wars are not shaped solely by grand strategies, conference room decisions, or technological leaps. They are also shaped by local judgments made under pressure, often by individuals far removed from strategic planning. These decisions rarely change the direction of a war on their own, but they influence how forces survive long enough to reach the next phase. Nothing about the Sherman tank itself changed that day. Its armor remained vulnerable, its gun remained limited against certain targets, and its mechanical reliability remained uncertain. No technical improvement suddenly corrected its shortcomings. What changed was the way it was employed, how terrain was read, how patience replaced impulse, and how restraint became a tactical choice rather than a default condition imposed by weakness. The same principle applied to the opposing force. The T-34 did not lose its physical advantages. Its gun remained effective, and its armor remained difficult to defeat under many conditions. What shifted was perception. Once crews encountered resistance that did not collapse on contact, the assumption of easy progress weakened. The tank's psychological dominance depended on expectation as much as on performance, and expectation can erode quickly. As the war continued into late 1950, the battlefield transformed rapidly. Heavier American tanks entered service in larger numbers. Air-ground coordination improved. Defensive lines stabilized, then advanced. The improvisation and uncertainty of the early weeks gave way to more structured operations. New doctrines emerged, informed by experience rather than assumption. The opening chaos receded, replaced by a different kind of contest. But the lessons from that early period did not disappear. They were absorbed into institutional memory, shaping how later operations were planned and executed. The Korean War became a case study not because of revolutionary technology, but because of how quickly conditions forced adaptation. Armies that relied on pre-war expectations struggled. Those that adjusted immediately endured. Modern military education continues to return to Korea for this reason. The conflict demonstrated how speed compresses decision-making and magnifies the cost of error. There was little time to test ideas gradually. Concepts were validated or disproven under fire. The environment rewarded clear assessment and punished rigidity. It remains a reminder that readiness is not static, and that wars rarely unfold as anticipated. The sergeant who commanded the ambush near Daejeon did not rewrite doctrine and did not appear in strategic histories. He did not claim credit, and his report used no dramatic language. He did not change the course of the war. What he did was recognize the limits of his equipment, the constraints of his terrain, and the urgency of his mission, and then act within those boundaries. This kind of judgment is common in war and rarely celebrated. It does not depend on inspiration or innovation, but on clarity. It requires accepting reality as it is, not as one wishes it to be. In many cases, it determines whether units survive long enough to fight again. The Korean War confirmed an old truth that extends beyond any single conflict. Machines matter. Numbers matter. Plans matter. But none of these operate independently. Their effectiveness depends on the decisions of the people who employ them, often in moments that never appear on maps or in headlines. Steel does not think. People do. And sometimes, on an unmarked road in the fog, that difference decides everything. That was one small episode from the opening weeks of the Korean War, where decisions made far from headquarters shaped outcomes on the ground. It did not change the course of the campaign, but it reveals how judgment, timing, and restraint mattered as much as equipment or numbers. Thank you for watching and for staying with us through this story. If this format is valuable to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to continue this work.